the home of the common Joe and the common Sally in the know, even more so than all those media talking heads. How's it going out today, boys and girls of Sport Land? Before we get to the podcast, I'd like to share something I read real quick in this lead up. Preface this by saying it is from the Bible, so if you get insulted, because some people do get insulted when I talk about religion in any kind of form, you can just go ahead and fast forward to the podcast, because it wouldn't matter to me if it was from the Bible, Sports Illustrated, anywhere. If I find it interesting, I'm going to share it. And it comes from the book of Luke, chapter 7, verses 36 through 50. Simon the Pharisee sitting down for dinner with Jesus, and this really sinful woman that's known to be a sinner around town comes in, and she's weeping, and she anoints Jesus with some oil, starts washing his feet with her tears that she's weeping, and drying them with her hair, kissing his feet. And Simon is over there looking at Jesus like, man, do you not know how bad of a sinner she is? And you're allowing her to touch you, and you're souling yourself with her? And Jesus sort of heard Simon's thoughts. And he's like, look, man, she come in here and put forth the effort, even though she's a great sinner, and she knew that everybody knew she was a sinner. By great sinner, I guess I assume they're talking about maybe she was a prostitute. And she's putting forth the effort to get my grace. Whereas all these other guys in here, they're not putting forth any effort. They're not showing any repentance for their sins. And guess what? We're all sinners. We all know this. We all do sins. If you go out there and you watch the Sports Illustrated version on ESPN, you sit there and you lust after a woman, and some guy you see at the bar drinking beer is talking to the pastor out in the parking lot, a guy that you know is he smokes drugs, or he drinks beer, and him and the preacher over having a good conversation in the parking lot, and the preacher's lapping him up and giving him pats on the back and hugging him, and you judge the preacher and you judge people in church by saying, man, if y'all so great, then why are y'all hanging out with these sinners? Well, Jesus hung out with the sinners. And that's what we need to realize, is that, you know, just because you see somebody that you consider of high moral standards hanging out with somebody that you consider not very good, it's not a bad reflection on that person. It's actually a good reflection that they're able to take the time to talk to that person and witness to that person, and take the chance that someone might judge them. So that's the message I got from it. It's just, let's just quit judging people. Let's worry about our own sins. Let's worry about sweeping out from under our own doorstep. Now, let's get to the podcast. We're off and running once again. Coming on in, the Outlaw Posse is in effect. And today we're going to talk about the schedule of the Oklahoma Sooners. I'm going to do this periodically throughout the year. I'm going to do one team from the top 10. Teams that I think are going to end up in the top 10 this coming year. And yes, Oklahoma is going to end up in the top 10 this year, in my opinion. But before we get to all that, this is the Outlaw of College Football. That stands for OCF, also known as JPC. That's spelled J-E-S-S-E without the I. Jesse Paul Clark on Facebook and on Twitter at OCF Productions. Now, getting right to it here. I'm going to throw the Oklahoma schedule up here in just a second. But before I get to all that, that little lead up that I did, by the way, I got that from this great Bible. Once again, the member gave me Tim Gillespie, great leatherback Bible, gold trim. Thanks, Tim, for that great present. Now, looking at this schedule, it looks like the Oklahoma Sooners may have a pretty nice little route to getting back where they belong. You know, last year's schedule might have been a little bit tougher than this year's. As a matter of fact, looking at this non-conference schedule that they have, I would say that they're right up there with Georgia, probably with the second easiest non-conference schedule. And that's not a slight. That's not me trying to insult the Sooners. I'm just saying that these teams that they're playing will probably lend for a good, fast start for Oklahoma and Dillon Gabriel and Brent Venables and company. Because looking at the schedules, you see they start off with Arkansas State, SMU, and at Tulsa. Now, the SMU game harkens back to days gone by. If it was an Oklahoma SMU game from the 1980s, this would be something to talk about. But it's not the 1980s. So, and Oklahoma's got a little something to prove. And they're going to take it out on these first three opponents. Tulsa, at Tulsa. I got a lot of respect for Oklahoma because they've done this before. People's like, why are they going to Tulsa? Is this some kind of little deal that they made with Tulsa, blah, 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 blah. And it may be some kind of little deal that I'm not privy to, but I have seen this matchup in the past, if you go back in your history books, and Oklahoma has played Tulsa in Tulsa before. This ain't something they're just now doing because they feel sorry for Tulsa. I got respect for that because, you know, Tulsa is not a major power in college football. They're not in the Power 5. And most teams like Alabama, my team, for example, won't even play the in-state schools unless they're a Power 5 school, which I've never understood because Alabama played Southern Miss for like 40 years in a row, and they've played Chattanooga, who's the FCS school, and Georgia Southern, who used to be an FCS school, but yet they won't play teams like Samford and UAB and Troy State because they're not Power 5 schools, and they feel like they ain't got nothing to gain from this. As a matter of fact, Alabama and Auburn went 40 years without playing each other. They just started playing each other in the 1950s, I think. Late 1940s. But I have a lot of respect for that. So, kudos to Oklahoma for allowing Tulsa to have a home game with them. And I think it's probably good for recruiting in the city of Tulsa. Now, moving on down the list here. They have to go to Cincinnati after that. And, you know, I've made a little noise about that in earlier podcasts where I thought that this was sort of an unfair thing to do to Oklahoma. Now, while Cincinnati is not nowhere near the Cincinnati team that made the playoffs that played Alabama, it's still a road game against a new team coming in. And Oklahoma is one of your stalwarts. They're a big brand. Even though they went 6-7 last year, they're a big brand in your conference. So why should they have to start the conference schedule off on the road against a new team when they're not going to get a return game from that? Just like I said they weren't. People are like, well, y'all going to be there 2025, so they'll go back to Norman. No, I told you they weren't going to go. That shit wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen, man, and it didn't. Oklahoma and Texas are splitting early. And so now Oklahoma will not get a return game on that. And I know it probably doesn't really matter to Oklahoma fans or anybody else out there because it's Cincinnati and they don't really have much of a home field advantage anyway to some people. But it's just the principle of the matter to me. So I think they'll do all right, though. I think they'll go into that game. They'll beat Cincinnati. Cincinnati fans may get a little fired up. They may fill up Nippert Stadium or whatever the hell they call that stadium these days. And then they have a home game against Iowa State. Iowa State's always been a tricky opponent for Oklahoma. So Iowa State, you just never know what you're getting. One year they'll be like winning 8-9 games, sometimes getting close to the 10-win mark, and then the next year they'll follow it up with a 3 or 4-win season. So you just never know what you get with Iowa State. But the good thing about this is it's not in Ames, it's in Norman, Oklahoma. So I think Oklahoma will clear this hurdle as well. And that'll make them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 0 going into the Texas game. The game last year where they got blew out, Dillon Gabriel was injured. Dillon Gabriel hopefully will not be injured in this game, and we'll get a good gauge of exactly how close Texas and Oklahoma are to each other as they go into the SEC in 2024. I think that Oklahoma will come back in this game with a vengeance. If they don't have a bunch of injuries like they did last time, 49-0, it's going to be a lot closer this time, I do believe, barring injury. But that could be their first loss of the year. So that's one of those iffy games that's hard to call either way, in my opinion. Then they come back home for a game against Central Florida, one of the newbies. Central Florida's been known to have pretty good teams off and on as well, sort of like Iowa State. They've had years where they went 10, 11, 12, went undefeated one year and claimed the Mickey Mouse National Championship the year Alabama won it. And them being in Orlando, that's ironic. Ain't it? They are the Mickey Mouse National Champions from that year. But I don't think Oklahoma will have any problem with Central Florida this year. I don't think it's going to be one of those vintage Central Florida teams that could upset you. So I could easily see Oklahoma being either 6-1 or 7-0 at this point. Then they have to go on the road to Kansas, who last year had a breakout year. Now, I've seen this happen lots of times where teams that have been known to be cellar dwellers have one little breakout year, and then they come back the next year, and they don't have quite as good a year. Sometimes they even bottom back out. I don't think Kansas is going to bottom back out, but I do think that they'll come down a little bit and probably only win about 5, maybe 6 games next year, and it won't be one against Oklahoma. Even though it's in Lawrence, we all know Lawrence is probably the crappiest stadium in the Big 12, if not the nation, as far as Division I schools go. I look for Oklahoma to win that game. Oklahoma then goes on the road to Oklahoma State in Bedlam. That'll be a little tricky because, you know, they'll have a little bit of vengeance in their hearts from last year's game, and they'll be wanting to send Oklahoma to the SEC with a loss, something to remember them by, because we all know that, well, they won like 19 games over 110 years or something. They want to go ahead and get that 20th win before Oklahoma just completely disappears. They try to act like they're mad about it, but I really think deep down inside, I think Oklahoma State wants Texas and Oklahoma to leave because now they think they'll have the run things. I'm not too sure about that, though. We'll see. Some of the new teams coming in might steal Oklahoma State's thunder, like BYU. But going in that game, that's a game they could lose. It's like Texas. It's one of those games that you just don't know. That could be a loss. They could catch a loss right there at Oklahoma State. Then they have a home game against West Virginia, a team that they nearly beat last year on the road, a team that they probably should have beat on the road. But they didn't. And I think they'll get a little revenge this go-around. So I think they'll be able to handle West Virginia. And by that time, West Virginia, with their coaching situation there with Neil Brown, he's really, really on the hot seat there. We were talking about getting rid of him last year. We may have a situation where Oklahoma runs into a team that doesn't have a coach, not have an interim coach at that point, and make the victory even that much easier. Then they go at BYU. Now, this is a real tricky game because BYU, it's just like Ohio State. You just never know what you're going to get. But BYU is the last non-Power 5 school to win a national title. One year they had 5 or 6 Power 5 schools on the schedule from the Pac-12 and beat every single one of them. So this ain't a team. This ain't your normal run-of-the-mill G5 school that's going to be in awe, especially in BYU. And with the elevated heights there, and it being harder to breathe up there and whatnot, Oklahoma may run into some issues up there. I mean, it would not surprise me if BYU were to upset Oklahoma in that game. But it's one of those games, once again, it's back and forth. So Oklahoma, I think, is in pretty good position so far to be close to undefeated at this point. Then they end up the year with TCU, and I think TCU, now I'm not sure y'all can correct me on this, but I don't think their quarterback's coming back, but he may be. I haven't really investigated that. If their quarterback's coming back, that could be a problem for Oklahoma. They could lose that game, even though it's in Norman. TCU is not, they're not in awe, just like BYU. TCU made the playoffs last year, got a good win over Michigan, but then turned around and just completely shit the bed and embarrassed themselves against Georgia. So we'll see if there's some lingering effects to that. I think there may be. I think TCU had an exceptional year, and it was just they had so many good lucky breaks go their way. That team could have easily lost 3 games last year. And in the end, I think they'll probably lose this game to Oklahoma as well. So looking at this schedule, if I had to give an overall prognosis of this schedule, I definitely don't see them going 6-7 again. I think it's going to be a lot better. And I think that this could end up being one of those years where you go 10-2, maybe even 11-1. We shall see. You guys and gals tell me what you think about all this. What do you think the pitfalls are for Oklahoma? Do you think there's any pitfalls for Oklahoma? Drop in the comment section. Also, there's a heart down here. If you don't mind, hit that. Throw me a few dollars in the coffers. And as always, KMCA to all the other teams. Class is now officially dismissed.